Good morning, everyone. My name is Herman Pretorius, and I am the Deputy Head of Policy Research for the Institute of Race Relations. At the outset of this morning's briefing, could I perhaps ask all attendees to mute themselves and turn off their cameras so that it is mostly a discussion between Gabriel and myself, so that we can dive deep into the brilliant report that Gabriel has written for us. So, Black Lives Matter is a movement that has taken the world by many storms in recent years, and as an institute and an organization with a rich history of 90 years, almost a century, in studying and understanding race relations, we feel that we at the Institute of Race Relations are almost uniquely placed to approach this subject in a way that is responsible, that is compassionate, that is understanding, but that is uncompromising in our insistence to understand the truth and what the data and the facts genuinely show us. In this regard, my colleague Gabriel Crouse, who is a researcher and an analyst at the Institute of Race Relations, has written a rather brilliant research paper looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, the title being "Because Black Lives Matter, What Institutions Need to Know About the BLM Global Network." In this regard, this morning's session will be quite straightforward. It will be a conversation between Gabriel and myself, with Gabriel doing most of the talking because he has the most interesting things to say this morning. I will facilitate. The conversation it will probably be about 30 to 40 minutes, and after that, I will open the floor to some questions from our journalist friends in attendance. If at that point you have a question, you can either raise your hand or you can use the chat function, but more on the logistics of that later. All the formalities then being, I think, addressed. Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Herman. Thanks for the introduction. It's nice to have an opportunity to talk about, I think, something very important to many people in this country and America, around the world.
Now, looking at you sitting in the wonderful library that I think I recognize as the library of the Institute of Race Relations, I can't help but think that my first question must be the cover image of this document. Why did we choose that one?
All right. So on the cover, we have the faces of three women that I think many people won't recognize in South Africa. And in fact, many people wouldn't recognize in America. They are the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. Their names are Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. And I think that it's important for people who are thinking about endorsing Black Lives Matter or who have endorsed Black Lives Matter to appreciate that this movement was not from nowhere, that there were organizers behind it, that there were thinkers behind it, that there's an ideology behind it. And those are the faces of those thinkers. And I think that when we begin to grasp that fact, that there are real people, real persons that can relate just as I am to you, then we can get a better understanding of what their intentions are with the movement going forward and what they've already done in the past 7 odd years since they founded Black Lives Matter in 2013.
Now, the last question on the superficial before we open the report, as it were, and really delve deep. I would just like to remind all attendees to please mute their microphones just to make the process as painless as possible. The title of the paper is "Because Black Lives Matter, What Institutions Need to Know About the BLM Global Network." Now, the first question that I do need to ask you, and that will be, I think, a very reasonable question to be asked of you, is: are you saying Black lives do not matter, or what's your statement surrounding Black Lives Matter, or perhaps is Black Lives Matter the movement and Black Lives Matter the sentiment really interchangeable?
Right. So no to the first part of that question and yes to the second part. I think that Black Lives Matter as a slogan is sound. We delve into that in the report. It's sound in two senses. One sense in which it's sound is that every person who's a member of the race designated as Black is unique from a secular point of view. You might say deserves equality before the law, has that dignity which is endowed on all human beings. From a religious point of view, you might say has a soul. And so that means that that subset of people, of all people, matter. There's another sense in which the statement is sound, and that is that it seeks to draw special attention to this group of people rather than all people simpliciter. And there are contexts in which that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. In fact, I'd say it's a duty to draw attention to the fact that Black lives do matter whenever it's the case that the appearance is to the contrary, and in particular when it's the case that the appearance is to the contrary because of state violence. So in both of those regards, Black Lives Matter is a sound slogan, and I stand for that. The slogan is but one tool of the movement, and the movement is ultimately a tool of the organization that drives it. And it's in this regard that I disambiguate Black Lives Matter as an idea, as a sentiment, as you say, as a slogan, from Black Lives Matter as an organization. And this is why, right from the title, we have BLM Global Network. That is the name of an organization. It holds assets. It has a tax registration number. It has organizers. It has salaries that it pays. And that is different to the slogan. If it were the case that every organization should be judged by its name or slogan only, then I think every workers' party in the world would have to be celebrated, because workers, after all, do matter. Every nationalist party would have to be respected, because, of course, nations do matter. But we know, and I don't think anyone needs to be told, but for the sake of redundancy, we repeat this, that what label is on top of the box is not the same necessarily as what's inside the box. And since this is a debate about labels, I think that is a very good launch point.
It's earlier this in the last 2 weeks, I wrote an opinion piece in which could I just ask all participants to please mute themselves. I'm perhaps going to be quite aggressive in my muting of participants. But I wrote a piece in which I said, don't make the North Korean mistake of thinking that the Democratic Republic, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is democratic, the people's, a republic, or covers the whole Korean peninsula. So it's interesting that you make, in the report, you make this distinction between an organization and a sentiment or a movement or a slogan, which I think we can all agree is sound. One interesting thing that you say is, the assets of this organization run into the millions, if I understand correctly.
If I can pick up on your points, of course, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor really an empire. So BLM started as basically a garage enterprise. Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi trying with very little resources to get a thing going, mainly using a hashtag, mainly using social media activism, sometimes derided as slacktivism, but they were not slacktivists at all. They were very trained and very disciplined. By 2015, they got their first major break, and that was after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, an interesting case we might get back into. Their slogan, together with the slogan "Hands Up, Don't Shoot," went viral. by some accounts, shared 21 million times over a short period in the US. And that drew a lot of attention, not only to the idea of police violence, but also to their movement in particular. And they leveraged that attention to raise money. Of course, raising money involves all kinds of tax events. And so after they became the Time Person of the Year, or runner-up Time Person of the Year, a great accolade for them, I'm sure, they approached 1,000 Currents, which is a non-profit sort of umbrella organization which works as a consulting firm, basically to help NGOs manage their finances. 1,000 Currents then moved Black Lives Matter nominal HQ to Delaware, which is basically a tax haven state. It has some of the lowest taxes in America. And they started collecting serious money. By 2019, their net assets were valued at $3.4 million. So it's about 70 million rand. And that's their net assets. They'd already been paying salaries. They already established more than 40 chapters around the world, each chapter involving someone who's being paid. They've got assets. They've got office blocks. They've paid for media campaigns and for hosting events. We at the Institute know, this kind of thing takes money. They have a lot more of it. After the death of of George Floyd in 2020, their fundraising campaign went through the roof. And in just a few weeks, they reported to the Associated Press that they had raised 1.1 million donations at an average of $33 a donation, which comes to $33 million. Of that $33 million, they pledged $12 million to particular projects and kept the rest for themselves for later, which means that at the moment, their net asset value is looking like R500 million.
Now, are we saying that in and of itself is a bad thing?
No, not at all. They are. What it is to say is that they're very serious activists, and that they appreciate what you need for activism includes public platforms, access to very widespread American platforms like CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post. So they sort of get the free media there, but it also requires paying salaries. And I sort of admire their tenacity and their enterprise in that regard. I do want to draw attention to the fact that there's another official there's another organization, not for profit, that has the Black Lives Matter in its name. This is called the Black Lives Matter Foundation, as opposed to the Black Lives Matter Global Network. This was also originally founded in California, much later, and it was founded by a man called Robert Ray Barnes. So I have to check my notes there. Now, his idea was because Black Lives Matter, what we need to do is grow a sense of unity between Black people and the police, between all people and the police. We need civility, we need harmony, we need unity. As a result of this, in part, the BLM Foundation has been derided in every major American publication that I can find. The story was first launched by BuzzFeed about a month ago, but since then it's been picked up almost everywhere. It's been derided as fake Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter as an idea or as a movement now stands for disharmony between the police and the public. It stands for defunding the police, and it stands for a series of other reforms. It does not stand for civility and harmony between the police. This is one of the bases upon which Robert Ray Barnes' organization has been slandered. Another is that he hasn't spent some of the money that he's raised. I'm not too sure about that. If so, that's no good. So yeah, there are definitely two different ideas about Black Lives Matter. And there's only one that's winning in the public square.
And that's the Black Lives Matter, the more, I don't think it would be unfair to say the more aggressive version of the movement, led by the three ladies on the cover of this report.
Yes, it's the more revolutionary. And I suppose before getting further into BLM Global Network, it's worth saying that although they're the three co-founders, and there are chapter heads. For example, the DC chapter head said that Black Lives Matter means defund the police. She was criticizing the Washington, DC mayor who'd painted Black Lives Matter in sort of 10-meter high letters down one of the avenues of the US Capitol. And they said, no, this is not the point. The point is to defund the police. But they are not alone. They are sort of independent actors that have in the public mind been deemed to be Black Lives Matter leaders. One of them is Colin Kaepernick. He was a footballer, B-string footballer who refused to stand up while singing the American national anthem a few years ago, insisted instead on taking a knee to draw attention to Black Lives Matter. And there's the Reverend Al Sharpton, who is a famous American evangelist who spoke at George Floyd's funeral and has led Black Lives Matter rallies. And so Colin Kaepernick, for example, wrote a tweet just after George Floyd died, which he pinned up. And I'd like to just read this out. When civility leads to death, revolting is the only reaction. The cries for peace will rain down, and when they do, they will fall on deaf ears. We have the right to fight back. So again, we sort of get the sense that there's this Black Lives Matter movement, which the organization is the principal actor of, but which has gained broader celebrity support, which stands very much at odds with what, for example, BLM Foundation would like, which is harmony, peace. They're making the cries for peace. Colin Kaepernick and others say, no, the cries for peace must fall on deaf ears.
So the first thing that I think people should know about, well, at least that I found from reading the report, is firstly that Black Lives Matter is not just a sentiment. It is an organization with headquarters, with a tax number, with all those, tangible ideas. So that's the first thing. When someone speaks about Black Lives Matter, it's not just a sentiment. It is a tangible organization. The second thing is that it has a very firm ideological base, but it also contextualizes or founds itself on some legitimate grievances. You've already spoken about police and unity or disunity between societies or communities and the police. Why is this an important element to look at in understanding what Black Lives Matter, the movement, is?
Okay, so Black Lives Matter's thesis is that people in America that are Black have fundamentally different experiences, that they are effectively second-class citizens, which no one ought to be, and that this is a result of racism. And one point upon which we certainly agree is that the American state has arbitrarily abused its power to disenfranchise and disempower and oppress Black people for centuries. So that's a good sort of opening reason to wonder whether that's continuing to happen. And when you see particular paradigm exemplars, you see the video of George Floyd with a knee to his neck struggling. You see the testimony of Michael Brown's killing, of Trayvon Martin's killing. You've got to wonder to yourself, are police brutalizing Black people at their own arbitrary discretion because America is a fundamentally racist society? Black Lives Matter's thesis is that America is a fundamentally racist society, and that anytime a bad thing happens to a Black person, this is the ultimate cause. There might be more proximate causes, but the ultimate cause is always systemic racism, white supremacy, and so on. And so I think given the history and given the fact that we do see these hugely distressing bits of evidence that at first glance might support their thesis, I think it's very important to take it seriously and try and figure out what's really going on.
And looking at the police, looking at the killing of George Floyd, what does the data show us? Is the American police system systemically racist from an objectively data-based perception?
Okay, I'd like to get to the data, but just start with some stories. So one of the things that I quote at length in the report is a piece by Coleman Hughes called Stories and Data. In his publication, City Journal. I strongly encourage people to read it. He's a young Black American who was about the same age as Trayvon Martin when he died in 2000, when he was killed in 2013 by George Zimmerman. And he had a Black Lives Matter t-shirt by 2015. He was very committed to the movement. He was very impassioned by the sentiment and naive about the organization behind it. As he matured, having sort of gone to university and learned to study and learned to think about these things, he started to dig into the stories and the data. And he went for stories first because he noticed that what first drew him in were stories and not data. And so what he first wanted to answer was stories and not data. And he, in his piece, lists about 20 stories of white Americans who had been killed, who were unarmed by the police. In some senses, the most harrowing one is of a 6-year-old child who was shot dead by the police in the passenger seat of the car. The police were trying to shoot the child's father, who at the time was unarmed and had his head and arms out of the window. No charges were laid, no trial, no one went to jail. Perhaps the most pertinent story is of a man named Tony Timper. Tony Timper was in Dallas. He was he needed to take medical treatment for his psychological conditions. He couldn't get the medical treatment. He was out on the sidewalk. He'd been trying to get some donuts or something. It was late at night, and he was starting to freak out. And he knew, he'd been taught through his psychological treatment that if he's freaking out in this way, he needs to call for help. So he called 911. 911 sent the police, and they detained him. They put him down on the ground. He wanted the help, but he started to get a bit nervous. He was shaking about, so they put him down on the ground. They cuffed him. They put a knee to his neck for 13 minutes until he died. There is a video of exactly what happened, and this video is freely available and has been for years, for 2 years. And you can hear, while he's crying out for help and saying he can't breathe and asking them to please just get the knee off of the neck, they laugh at him. And after he dies, they laugh at him again. They make jokes about him, about this crazy fool. No one was charged. There was no trial. No one went to jail. There was no accountability. Now, there was also no attention drawn to that case. I hadn't heard of that case until Coleman Hughes drew it to my attention. And I watched the video, which he encouraged me to do, and it did something to my heart, which is at an emotional level, it made me rethink my biased assumption, which I had, which was that American police would never do to a white person what they did to George Floyd. And once I saw that video, there was a paradigm shift.
What was Timper's skin color?
Timper was white. And so I think it's incumbent on everyone who is thinking about endorsing or who has endorsed Black Lives Matter to watch that video as a start, to think about the claim which I've heard, which I had on a debate on CGTN Africa with an American professor who said no white person would ever be subjected to the treatment that George Floyd was subjected to. She was a Black Lives Matter professor and supporter. I think everyone who wants to support it should watch that video and rethink their position. But now this is at the level of anecdote, and anecdote can be misleading. So let's look at the level of broader data. Here, the most important study, I believe, to consider is by Professor Roland Fryer, Jr. of Harvard University. He was the youngest black tenured professor of Harvard University. He was a MacArthur genius. He really is an extraordinary man, a bit troubled in some ways. One of the ways that he's troubled is that he grew up in the South and as a teenager was a hustler. His father went to jail when he was very young. He fell into a life of crime, selling fake goods. And at one point, he tells the story about the police riding after him. He wonders if they're coming after him. He sees a white school friend on the side of the road. He says, "Hey, man, get in the car with me," because he assumes that if he's got a white dude with him, the police are less likely to pull him over. That doesn't work. They try getting out of their car and running away from the police, and a bunch of police surround them, draw their guns on them, put them to the ground, and arrest him. So he's traumatized by that experience. He admits it, and it makes him emotionally connected to the idea that black people are subject to police brutality in a way that's just not true for white people. And it's on the basis of this that he started to investigate in 2015, 2016, the claim that police brutality is racially biased in America. He was looking for evidence that it is racially biased. He's very open. He was open about this at the time. He's open about the connection to his own biography. But he's also very open about the fact that he is an economist. And the reason he has the status that he does is because he puts facts before narrative. He breaks down the problem into three categories, and I think this is brilliant. He breaks it down to three different questions. One is, are the police more likely to encounter a black person? In other words, if you're walking, driving, and so on, are you more likely to be pulled over by the police if you're black? Second is, if you are approached or encountered by the police, are the police more likely to use non-lethal force if you're black? And if they use non-lethal force, is it more likely to be more extreme or less extreme? And then the third question is, are you more likely to be killed by the police if you're black? Now, on the first question on police encounters, I think everyone has this assumption that the police only go after black people, that you get pulled over for driving while black. He finds that if you just go off demography, that's true. But if you start taking into account other variables, which across time and space, across countries, have been known to be associated with increased or decreased police encounters, then that pattern disappears. In fact, using a series of variables, none of them to do with race, most important one being unemployment in the last 10 days, unemployment in the last 100 days, unemployment in the last year, he finds that not only does the racial bias disappear, in fact, black people are 8% less likely to be encountered by the police. So that's very interesting. Another finding which I draw attention to is the fact that white people, well, let's just leave it at that. His baseline conclusion for police encounters is that there is no evidence that there's racial bias in police evidence at national level, and at a municipal level where he looked, the evidence is not statistically significant one way or another. Now for non-lethal force. Here Fryer finds that black people are more likely to encounter non-lethal force, even taking into account the kinds of variables that sort of made the pattern of discrimination disappear in the first case. So it does look like, and in particular, I should explain that non-lethal force here means that the police putting their hands on you rather than not putting their hands on you. It means the police putting handcuffs on you, even if you're not being arrested. And then it scales up to being tased, being batoned, being pepper sprayed, being beaten, but there's much less of that. And he finds that as you climb up to the more severe applications of force, the racial bias almost disappears. To quote him, he says it does disappear. It disappears. Full quotes in the report. But with the much less aggressive applications of force, hands and cuffs and so on, he finds that there's significant bias. Now, there's some caveats to this. One of them is that that bias is much less at night compared to the daytime. Another one is that I just want to sort of consult my notes to try and remember what the caveats were. Another one is that it's geographically specific. So in New York City, for example, 15% of white people experience force from the police. Nationally, only 1% experience force from the police. They have much more proactive policing in New York than they do elsewhere. Whereas the national average is 3.5% for black people. So 1% for white people, 3.5% for black people, 15% for white New Yorkers. So it's not entirely straightforward. A third thing is that, as I said, as you climb up the more severe applications of police brutality, the racial distinction starts to go away. But the one central point, which is very interesting, can only be made when you look at killing. So let me go to that, and then I'll just come back to this one. When you look at police killing, the reason there's several reports. I've read 4 studies that find there's no racial bias in officer killing of black Americans. But Rowlands is the most interesting. Professor Fry's is the most interesting because he's the only guy who does what statisticians call finds the zeros. So he finds cases where the police would have been justified, according to the rules and regulations, to shoot a person, but they did not shoot a person. Everyone else is just looking at shootings and trying to figure out from there what it looks like. He finds particular cases, shoot or don't shoot. Are the police more likely to pull the trigger when there's a black person there? He finds the opposite. He finds that the police are 30% less likely to shoot a black person than to shoot a white person. Well, that's particularly for tasing. Black people are 24% more likely to be tased rather than shot. White people are 24% more likely to be shot rather than tased. 30% and 24% for shooting or not shooting, with all other options on the table. So if you go back to then the non-lethal force, you start to see that that also suggests that on the higher levels of non-lethal force, it might be that this very small level of overrepresentation of black Americans there is partly due to the fact that they're less likely to be shot than white people, which shows, if anything, a racial preference for black lives rather than a racial dispreference for protecting black lives.
Now, I think the long and short of this is that, at least while there are legitimate concerns about police incidents and, police brutality and general failures of justice, would it be right to conclude that Black Lives Matter, the more aggressive strand of Black Lives Matter, that is really winning the culture war, at least in the United States, and it's recently spilled over into South Africa, that this idea of systemic police racism, not necessarily police failure or police brutality, that's a separate issue and we can come to that, but that systemic police racism is just not something borne out by the facts.
I want to agree with you that it's as simple as that. I can't. I've got to stand by Fryer's analysis that when it comes to non-lethal force, it does look like there's some evidence that black people and the police, and I think a lot of it's because of mistrust going both ways. Black people are much less likely to call the police in America, even if they suffer a robbery. Police seem similarly to have, oh, by the way, one more reason for doubting that it's, what I will say is I don't think it's animus. So Fryer finds that this asymmetry, this racial asymmetry in the application of non-lethal force, which is totally not a Black Lives Matter issue. They won't talk about that. Fryer wishes they would talk about that. But the asymmetry is exactly the same for white cops, Hispanic cops, and black cops. So it's not like you've got racist white cops who are more likely to put their hands on or cuff people. It's white cops, black cops, Hispanic cops. And I think that strongly suggests that there is a mistrust which is higher amongst black Americans and the police than it is amongst white Americans and the police. And I think that is a real problem. I wouldn't say that it's like racism, systemic racism, white supremacy, but it's a problem to do with race. And I think that's a genuine problem when it comes to police encounters, when it comes to officer-involved shootings, when it comes to killings by other means, no evidence for violence. But this is not to say that Black Lives Matter is just mistaken in its reading of the data, which it hasn't read. It's actually making the problem worse. Roland Fryer, together with a PhD student called Tanaya Devi at Harvard, have just released a study. In fact, they've just released a study about what happens when you investigate systemic racism in American police departments. They're called pattern in practice investigations. They were initiated after 1992, the LA riots, the first sort of televised viral image of a black person being beaten up by the police. And that was followed by riots which destroyed potentially billions of dollars in property, in which many people were killed. It was a major crisis. And at the time, the Department of Justice, the president issued a new regulation under which the Department of Justice could go in, the federal government could go in to a municipality and investigate whether there's systemic bias in racial policing just there, in that particular police department. Fryer and Devi looked at 20 such investigations, and they found that most of them had salubrious effects. Crime went down. Police were encouraged by the opportunity to, look at potential things that they're not getting right and do better. Sometimes there was no real effect. Sometimes there were salubrious effects. But in some cases, there were dramatic effects to the detriment. They look at 5 such cases. 3 of them being Black Lives Matter movements, and 2 of them being viral moments that came before Black Lives Matter. And these are situations where images or a story goes viral nationally through organized, energized Reverend Al Sharpton or Black Lives Matter drawing attention to this. And then the police get investigated. And what they find is the police completely withdraw from Black communities, and in general withdraw from policing at all. They see in some cases up to 100% reduction in policing. I think that was in Baltimore. In Chicago, something like 50% reduction in policing. And in the next 2 years, Fry and Devi find in excess of 400 excess murders compared to what you would expect without the investigation and the viral incident, and 30,000 excess felonies. And they make this comparison, not me. They say that if you look at the per annum death rate of Black individuals as a result, statistically, from what they find, of the combination of these viral protests and then investigations on the back of these viral protests, more Black people die per annum from that than from lynchings at the peak of American white supremacist racism, 1880 to 1902. 3 times more people are dying per annum as a result of the combination of systemic pattern and practice investigations and Black Lives Matter vilification of the police. So I don't think Black Lives Matter's thesis is just incorrect in an academic sense. I think that they are part of a problem. And in the report, we draw attention to 4 such cases of Black people who've been killed under the aegis of Black Lives Matter protests. One is David Dawn, a retired police officer, 78-year-old man, working as a security guy to try and stop Black Lives Matter associated protesters from looting a store. He's shot dead. Another is Marie Cully, who goes to a Black Lives Matter protest. Much like me when I was younger, thought Black Lives Matter, that sounds like a sound slogan. I want to go and support that peacefully. I want my voice to be heard. I want things to change. She goes. The protest turns violent. She tries to run away. As she's getting into a car, as she's fleeing the violent protest, she is shot in the back, dead. David Patrick Underwood is another case that we get into, and there's another one. But these are just sort of 4 stories. Remember, we're doing the stories and data. The stories are important to give you a real human sense of what's going on here, but the data has it that hundreds of people every year as a result of every single one of these incidents have been murdered, which statistically would not likely have been murdered because there would have been a real police presence. So defund the police and sympathize with and apologize for looting, vandalism, and so on. This is not just an academic mistake. This is a very, very serious wrong.
The 4th instance that you discuss in the report is Chris Beatty. And I think perhaps I phrased my earlier question inelegantly. The point that I'm trying to drive at is that protagonist and antagonist, villain and hero, these labels are too easily and too simplistically applied to police and Black Lives Matter by several groups. Police, sometimes unequivocally seen as villains, sometimes unequivocally seen as heroes. That's wrong. The data doesn't bear that out. Black Lives Matter, sometimes unequivocally seen as heroes, sometimes unequivocally seen as villains. Also wrong because they have legitimate grievances. But I think an interesting thing that James Lindsay said when he spoke to some of us at the IRR a while ago was that anecdotalization of narratives and anecdotalization of issues really drives the philosophical foundation of the Black Lives Matter in critical race theory, is that it not only doesn't look at the data, it has an active abhorrence to data, thereby not reaching the sober, sensible conclusions that you might reach, that, you know, this isn't a simplistic issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that one way that has played out is that Coleman Hughes, who I referred to earlier, has been denounced by some friends of the Black Lives Matter movement, members of the Black Lives Matter movement, as, please forgive me for quoting this term here, Koonman Hughes. Uh, Professor Fryer has also been denounced as an Uncle Tom. In one extremely stark case, and these are by Black Lives Matter movement people who sort of don't want the data to come here, and so they use a racially coded language to shame Black people for trying to do science, which is thereby cast as a white thing, which I think is crippling to the mind and to the soul. Another example is, I can't remember the name right now, but a week or two ago, I read an issuance for a request to retract an academic paper by American academics who had found no evidence of racial discrimination in officer-involved shootings. So these academics, tenured, well-to-do, they do the research, they find no racial discrimination in officer-involved shootings, they publish their journal article, it's then quoted in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, as an interesting bit of science to look at. They then ask the original academic journal to deplatform themselves. They explain our academic research was sound, our conclusions were sound, everything that we wrote was correct, but it is being used by people to undermine the Black Lives Matter narrative. And we would rather that you pull our research from the public sphere. We would rather that you discredit it, even if it's right, than allow our names to be associated with evidence that undermines some of the BLM Global Network Foundation, the BLM Global Network's claims, as opposed to, for example, the BLM Foundation, or as opposed to those who might want to, like Coleman Hughes. Coleman Hughes makes a very good point. He says, look, all lives matter. There's a problem with all lives matter, which is that for the last 5 years, it's more often than not been used as a clapback against Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter protesters come up and they say, look, it looks like there's racial bias and systemic in policing. Black lives do matter. Can't we change that? And people say, all lives matter. Don't say that. Coleman Hughes says, no, that's not a good way to use that phrase. It's a profound moral insight that all lives matter. Don't weaponize it in this way. He says, all lives matter could be a unifying slogan for an American population that is fed up with police brutality, with arbitrary application of force, and fed up with it happening to Black people or white people. So if it's not a clapback, if it's a join in, hey, Black lives matter. That's true. So do Chinese lives. So do Indian lives. So do Irish American lives. So do all American lives. Let's try and fix things. That'd be good. And just one more note on the data. Things have improved in terms of police brutality. Certainly in terms of police brutality against Black people. The finding of Professor Fryer that Black people are less likely to be shot than white people becomes much less surprising when you consult the data of the Mapping Police Violence Survey, which is better than the Washington Post survey for various reasons, one of them being that they include non-officer involved shootings, people who get killed not necessarily by a gun. So they've got a larger set to draw from. And they find that in 2015, I just want to look at this number to get it exactly right. In 2015, 78 Black people, unarmed Black people, were killed by the police. In 2019, that had come down 64% to 28, and the same in 2018. So 64% reduction in that. White unarmed people being killed by the police, about double that, 52. So some of these cases, I think, some of these cases certainly are going to be like Tony Timper, like George Floyd, unjust. Some of these cases, just because the person's not armed doesn't mean they're not a threat to society. Investigation should be happening. But the overall trend in the last 5 years has been an accelerated decrease in the deaths of unarmed Black people at the hands of the police. And if you stretch that out, as Coleman Hughes does, over the last 30, 40 years, it's even more extreme, the decrease. So I think although that kind of all lives matter anti-police brutality movement hasn't had the traction in the public square that it might have had, it has been taking effect in the actual administration of justice, and in particular in the actual administration of justice, there's been a serious decrease in the deaths of Black people. And I think that's something worth drawing attention to, because another thing that Black Lives Matter does, which I think is extremely unfortunate, and now I'm talking about the global network side, the side that's winning in the culture war, is that they denounce all signs of progress. Their thesis is that progress is not possible. And part of the reason for this is that history is on their side. If you look back to America 250 years ago, then certainly Black lives were not being treated with the respect that they deserve. So any evidence that's happened since then is only to be welcomed if it reaffirms that nothing has changed. Evidence that reaffirms that things have changed are ignored, and like ignoring science in general, ignoring actual practical engineering as opposed to science, sort of as a study, engineering as an implementation of a solution, evidence that solutions have been implemented that have made things better is willfully ignored because it undermines the basic ideological principle that we are still in 1776 here.
Now, we've spent some time on this, and I think it's very useful that we have spent some time on this, because I think three fundamental things have been established. Firstly, what the Black Lives Matter movement really is, more than a sentiment, an actual organization with actors, with motives, with ideology. Secondly, that it is an organization that latches onto genuine grievances. However, thirdly, that it is an organization that has not been a positive or a constructive actor in accurately and responsibly defining the problems and then going over to solution-based thinking. But let me pull this to a South African context as a closing segment of our discussion.
Wait, before you do that, can I say one thing quickly, because we didn't get into this, and before we come back to South Africa, one last thing about America. So we've mentioned the names of the Black Lives Matter Fund Global Network leadership. Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors are self-described trained Marxists. I'm not labeling them. They label themselves. Opal Tometi visited Maduro and said, the dictator of Venezuela, and said, here the Bolivarian revolution has finally brought democracy, freedom, and peace to Venezuela. This at a time when millions of Venezuelans are literally have lost a dozen kilograms or more because of mass hunger and economic malaise. The Black Lives Matter Foundation Global Network is an official member of the Movement for Black Lives, which is sort of its policy arm, which lays out what it'd like to have in an official capacity. It has called for halving U.S. military spending. It has called for an abolition of all U.S. military bases beyond its borders. It's called for free dental care for everyone, free higher education for everyone. It's called for
destruction of private education.
Yes, no more private schooling. That's evil and wicked. No more billionaire philanthropists donating to private education, because that is when Black people go to those schools, they're being lost to the Black community. They have called for, just such a long list of
for a UBI for Black people, only for Black people, universal basic income,
special tax rebate for Black people, special payment out to Black people for being Black. They've called for Black sites. They want cultural reparations. So they want Black sites of Black sacred sites to be established around the country, which of course goes hand in hand with the more on the ground defacing and vandalizing of statue and removal of statues of Ulysses S. Grant, the Union General who defeated the slavers, of Abraham Lincoln's memorial, who defeated the slavers, and the very same steps that they defaced were the steps that Martin Luther King Jr. stood upon to make his famous address, to say, I have a dream in which the content of your character will be the thing upon which you're judged, and not the color of your skin. And I think it's no accident that those are the steps that were defaced. Black Lives Matter Global Network ideologically fundamentally stands against that principle. It stands against the idea of non-racialism and for the idea that we need better kinds of racialism. And to achieve that, you need a total social upheaval, which means the erasure of property rights, the erasure of civil liberties, the codification of race, and an overhaul of everything from dental care to military spending.
If I may ask a provocative question, do you think the Black Lives Matter movement, that is currently winning the culture war, would you ally it to Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela or Hendrik Verwoerd ideologically?
I would align it to Hendrik Verwoerd. I think the grandfather of the Black Lives Matter movement is W.E.B. Du Bois. He was one of the great American academics, intellectuals, and leaders coming out of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. He went to Harvard, where he was trained by professors who all were trained in German, and then he went to Germany, to Berlin, under Bismarck in the 1880s, where he learned from various professors, one called Heissig, I think, who said that a race is a fundamental unit of human value. Individuals are valuable insofar as they are members of their race. W.E.B. Du Bois took on this idea and said, I quote him at length in the report, he said that the history of the world is not the history of individuals, but of groups, not of nations, but of races. And anyone who wants to downplay the fundamental significance of a race is ignoring the fundamental thought of all human history. W.E.B. Du Bois noticed in Germany that there was a movement called the Volksgeist movement. Volksgeist, folk meant folk or race, and Geist means spirit, the spirit of the race. So his first book was the souls of black people. He wanted to import the idea that all black people share a metaphysical connection via a soul. There's one soul that's been distributed across various black bodies. He ramified that idea through a similar means to the BLM Global Network, to Opal Tometi, Patrice Cullors, and Alicia Garza. He was the founding father of the NAACP, the longest lasting and most famous Black American civil organization. And although that organization through the decades veered away from his original founding principles and towards non-racialism, it unfortunately veered back. And I think that BLM, one way to think of BLM, I like your Verwoerd thought, but I would like to put it like this. BLM is like the youth wing movement of Du Bois' NAACP. And Du Bois' NAACP was just the black equivalent to the German Volksgeist movement. And the difference between the two is how quickly they managed to get their hands on the levers of power. The German Volksgeist movement managed to do that within a few decades, and we all know what the consequences were in the 30s and 40s. The W.E.B. Du Bois branch of that movement and its new youth wing have not managed to get their hands on the levers of power as quickly.
I think, let me ask you, I'm going to ask you three quick questions that I want brief answers for before I go to a closing.
Yes, it'd be nice to have questions from the audience.
Discussion.
I'll be very brief.
Actually, these are from me before I go to the journalist.
Yeah.
Who is Petrus Michels?
Petrus Michels was killed on the first day of our lockdown. He was Ravensmead in the Western Cape. He was going along and he hadn't bought any booze in anticipation of the lockdown booze ban. So he went along and he found a friend who sold him a couple of quarts, and he was walking down the streets with these quarts, very densely populated little township area, so lots of eyewitnesses. The police, he's healthy, he's an old man, he's 60 or so, but he's a healthy old man who's gone to get his booze for the weekend, a couple of quarts. He's picked up by the police, put in the van, emerges dead.
Was he killed by systemic racism?
I don't believe so. The commissioner of the head of that police department is black, has been black for a long time. Previous iterations, the makeup of that police department is mostly black. I do think that there's a bigger story to tell about why he was killed, but no, I don't think racism is it.
Who is Sibusiso Amos?
Sibusiso Amos was killed in the second week or so of the lockdown. He went to a place that used to be a tavern before the lockdown to maybe get some drinks. The police arrived and they said, no, look, there's no drinks here, and they couldn't find any drinks. Significantly, a man by the surname Ndlovu was with the police, who is not a police. He's a private security. He was convicted of attempted murder in 1999. And he seems to be responsible for the killing of Sibusiso Amos as Amos moved from the one private residence to another, to his own home.
Was he killed by systemic racism?
There's no evidence to suggest that Ndlovu killed Amos because Ndlovu hates black people, is a self-hating black racist. No, there's nothing to suggest that. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Ndlovu is a violent man, unchecked and untrained. And it's very hard to tell why he was enforcing the law together with the police and why they were helping him and not protecting Amos.
What is Operation Notlela?
Notlela means lock. It's Operation Lockdown. That is the official sort of security forces term from the Command Council for the enforcement side of the lockdown that we've been subject to. And yeah, is that systemic racism? No, I struggle to see how it could be. I was on an interview on SABC1 in a debate, actually, broadcast on June 16th for Youth Day. And I was very disturbed when a member of a sort of South African NGO said that all of the people who were killed, 50 people were killed in the first 6 weeks or died in police, either killed by the police or died in police custody in the first 6 weeks of the lockdown. And some vague attention had been drawn to that from one of the audience members in Soweto, who was very concerned about this. And they said, well, no, don't worry. You must understand that what's happening is whenever the police kill someone, is to defend white supremacy and to defend white property. Now, property is not a white thing. A lot of black people have property and want to defend their property. In fact, I calculated last week that the black top 10% is 2.5 times richer than the white top 10%, earns 2.5 times more income. That's not the issue. The laws that were being enforced in both their cases and in the case of Collins Causa were lockdown regulations against alcohol, which has nothing to do with race and I think everything to do with something else. I also draw attention in the report to various claims by police leaders that you shouldn't be sorry for what happened in Marikana. You get one shot. It must not be a warning shot. It must be a kill shot. You must make people drink their own urine. You must crush their balls. Our leadership, our police, I think there are really a lot of good men and women in blue, but the incentives that they've been provided with have been strongly to the contrary of the constitutional norms upon which this country is founded.
A last question from my side. Given what we've discussed, I mean, we've gone all over the world and we've gone 2 centuries back, 3 centuries back at least. I want to quote directly from your report, I think the most powerful paragraph, and then I want you to discuss the 7 points that follow. It's under the heading BLM strategy. Given BLM's indifference to facts, its demonstrably horrific effects, its 19th century German ideology of inhumanism, its animus to wealth, and its call for total social upheaval, one may wonder why South African private institutions would throw their endorsements BLM's way. Strategy must be considered, laid out here in 7 steps. Knowing us, having dissected what BLM is, where it comes from, where it hits, where it misses, why should South Africans care about these 7 strategic steps you lay out here?
So your first question was, the question I asked in the report is, why would anyone endorse BLM knowing what we know? And the answer is, well, because they don't know what we know. People want to endorse BLM out of ignorance. And I was there. In 2017, I tried to join BLM. Many good people have had this impulse. Good people in my family have had this impulse of not knowing who Opal Tometi, Patrice Cullors, or Alicia Garza are, of not knowing what they stand for, of not knowing what they're doing, of not knowing the ideology they come from, the effects that they've had. You just hear the slogan, its sound, and you want to support people who are supporting that. So once you know what's going on, I think you also realize how it is that people endorse first ask questions later and then find themselves not being willing or able to retract that endorsement. Here's how it works. First, BLM Global Network gets your official endorsement on the basis of a prima facie justifiable grievance. Once you've done that, they use that endorsement both to raise funds, curry favor, and to ramify the norm, the social norm of their ideology, which is that you can judge guilt and innocence by phenotype. And you can judge the guilt and innocence of an institution by race. Once you're in that trap, you've endorsed an institution that endorses that idea of how you should look back on yourself. Then you're forced to investigate yourself for racism using its code, which divides your members, whether you're a school or a business or a hospital or whatever you are, by black and white, by guilty and innocent, by black and white. And once you've done that, you're sure to find grievances. You're sure to find people that are frustrated by being vilified in this way, people who, when tokened as paradigm heroes just by virtue of their skin, then play the role of saying how terrible things are, and that you need fundamental reforms that the institution cannot actually live up to. That's the key stick that BLM Global Network yields. The reforms that it demands and that you've endorsed already are impossible to satisfy without destroying your own institution. Because literally any institution that was founded by a white person is foundationally racist, to use one of their phrases. That means that institution must go before justice can truly be achieved. So anything that you do to try to bring yourself closer to the BLM ideal is not going to be enough. It's going to create ructions within the institution. And then if you don't go all the way and nullify yourself, abolish your own private school, abolish your own private hospital, abolish your own private dental practice, if you don't do that, it's not good enough, and it's evidence that you're still actually a white supremacist. And so then that then feeds the cycle, because it creates more evidence of racial tension, which then creates more spotlight time, airtime for the BLM Global Network, and more people think, wow, you know, we thought this issue went away. It didn't go away. It's actually worse because we're measuring by media time rather than by facts. We better endorse it, because if we don't endorse it now, it's never going to solve the problem. And that then sort of spreads the cancer further.
And this is genuinely the last question from me. Then I will go to any journalists who might have a question. Perhaps at this point I can say, any of our journalists in attendance, if you have a question, please use the chat function to type that question so that I could come to you, or raise your hand and I will also come to you. But these technological things often stand in the way of questions, and often we get many questions after the session has ended. But while questions might be typed or considered, let me ask this. We are classical liberals. The Institute of Race Relations has been a classical liberal organization for almost a century. Why have we published this report? Why did you write it? And what does the classical liberal have to say about going forward and solution-based thinking?
I think that we've published this report because we want to help people think clearly about how they can contribute to a better, freer South Africa, and more generally to non-racialism around the world. There are two ways fundamentally of dealing with a society whose salient cleavages are racial and trying to address the attendant problems. One of those solutions, the BLM Global Network solution, is more racism, but just of a different kind. So we want people to be judged according to the color of their skin, but we want the content of that judgment to be different to what it was before. The alternative, which hasn't been getting a lot of airtime and hasn't been getting a lot of attention, is non-racialism, which is to say the mistake is not that a person is being judged inferior or superior on the basis of their race, and you should flip that, or you should judge them equally on the basis of their race. The mistake is judging people on the basis of their race to start with. And if we take that approach to addressing our problems of police brutality in South Africa, insofar as there's a problem to do with race, the problem is that you're judging people on the basis of race. And so far as that's not the problem, there are other problems that we can address. Insofar as there are economic problems, there's economic problems if people are judging each other according to race. And if you get rid of that, then you've gotten rid of one of the problems. There might be other problems to deal with. This way of thinking is potent. It has been proved potent by every society that has taken it up. It has been proved potent from the beginnings of democracy, from Magna Carta in the UK in 1215, first book I bought with my own money when I was a lighty, to the theories of democracy that emerged from the ancients, to the very idea at the heart of all major religions, that there is a divine spark in each individual human being, which is incommensurate to any other human being, and whose value is absolute. Those are the bases for a productive society that is reason responsive, that is collaborative, and that is sensitive to what really matters. And that has been left out of the conversation for too long. And that needs to get back into the center of the conversation, because from that starting launch point, there is no challenge too great for the human being to solve it.
Excellent.
Not one that really matters. Anyway.
Gabriel, Crouse, thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone in attendance this morning, all our friends watching. I think Gabriel's closing remarks are something that I want to echo, and that I want to say that has been the purpose of this morning, is to start having this discussion, a sober, honest discussion, not a knee-jerk discussion, but an honest discussion that is compassionate, but that looks at what can be quantified as problems and what can be worked towards as solutions. On that note, the Institute of Race Relations is about to launch an engagement program with specific institutions, organizations, and entities. If you are a member of an organization that might be affected by the BLM movement, under pressure from the BLM movement, perhaps unsure as to how to react to a movement that really has fundamental weaknesses, even if it makes some correct diagnoses, please get in conversation with us, engage with us. Gabriel and I and my colleagues will be, over the next few weeks, attempting to proactively engage with organizations who have already fallen foul of wrong-headed thinking on this issue. But the fact that I always return to is that South Africans have been shown to be common sense, decent people. Every piece of data from the Institute of Race Relations underscores this. And if we want a non-racial South Africa, one where the complex arguments that Gabriel set out here finds real cognizance and affects real change, then there isn't a population I would entrust more than the South African population. Let's work together. Gabriel, thank you very much for your time this morning, for this brilliant report. Perhaps I could ask you a closing word or two from your side.
Yeah, my closing word is that I really do have a lot of sympathy for people who've been duped by the BLM Global Network. In 2017, I saw expropriation. 2018, I saw expropriation without compensation hit the South African universe. And I thought, who better to help us draw attention to what a bad idea this is than Black Lives Matter? Because so many of the people who are going to be knocked by the erosion of property rights in South Africa are poor Black people. And the case to be made is very clear. and very rigorous for that. And so I emailed several American journalists, friends of mine, to try and get in touch with Black Lives Matter leaders to say, look, here's something you can get behind. Property rights in South Africa need to be protected in order to protect Black lives in South Africa, and their lives do matter. And the journalists that I reached out to, some of them laughed at me, but a few of them were kinder, and they sent me things to read and to think about, to realize how bad my misimpression of that organization is. And I did, and my heart sank through my chest because I realized that this very prominent movement is not out to help. And it's disappointing, but it's that kind of disappointment that we have to learn from to grow.
Thank you, Gabriel. Perhaps a last opportunity to any of our journalists in attendance. I've received some of your emails with questions, but please, if you have a question for Gabriel or myself, I'll give you a last few seconds to unmute yourself to draw my attention to you.
Herman, maybe you did such a good job of asking questions that you covered all the possible bases.
I always knew at one point I would do a good job. Excellent. Gabriel, everyone, thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.